Hi, everyone. This is Illy, as you know, and I have with me today for today's masterclass, Dr. Annalyn Schooley. And Annalyn is a professor. I met her because she was an adjunct of one of my courses when I was doing my doctoral program. And she's also a licensed marriage and family therapist and mental health counselor in the state of Florida. Well, I think you've got licenses all across.
No, just Alaska. So I'm working on Ohio. But.
Okay. Well, Dr. Schooley teaches online full time, so there are times when it makes sense for her to get licenses in regions where her students are located. And she is a AMFT approved supervisor, and she's a supervisor to supervisors. She was my supervisor for my supervision process. So I'm really excited to have you here today, Annalyn. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Is there anything I missed or you'd like to add about you?
No, stunningly beautiful, witty beyond belief. I don't know, something.
That's true. That's true for sure. So today I've invited Annalyn to talk about the art and science of crafting questions. The reason for this is that lately I've been having these conversations in master classes with guest experts as well as on the blog. And it's something that I've also had in my mind from training, I'm sure, and also from Annalyn, that our work is a craft. It's a linguistic craft. And so welcome, and I look forward to hearing from you what this means to you and your experience. So I guess share with us how you see this, the art and science of crafting questions as essential to therapy and systemic therapy in particular.
Yeah. So it's funny, one of the things we have to do to be approved supervisors is we have to write a philosophy statement. And a very long time ago, I wrote my philosophy statement, and I leaned on Jay Haley at the time. And if it was important, I could find the actual chapter of the book that I read. But Haley talked about the importance of teaching the craft of therapy, that you had to teach skills for therapists, to become good. And I kind of took that on. I guess that fit for me. And so I have kind of taken that on as sort of my philosophy. I know there's lots of supervisors who are all about the self of the therapist. And I'm just not. In fact, I don't even really kind of care how my clients feel. I mean, they tell me, but I don't solicit that information because I'm really more interested about what they're going to do, right? How, as far as I'm concerned, you can feel different and think different, but if it doesn't result in different behavior, then that's nothing's changed, nothing's happened, right? So, and I'm kind of the same way about therapists, is it's what we do in the room. Now, our doing involves talking for the most part, right? It does have a little bit to do with physicality, but not a whole lot. And so for me, becoming a good therapist is about the craft of using what we say. And then also the nonverbal communication, which is the physical part of it. Yeah. So for me, it's about, what do I bring into the room? Because I can't control what the client brings into the room. They are, I can assess for that. I can ask questions about it, but I can't control that. So the only thing I have any power over is what I bring. So my attitude, my behavior, my questions, my thinking, that's what I bring in. And I suppose how I feel, but then that I got to make sure that it just doesn't get in the way. When I do talk about feelings, it's more about how these feelings are getting in the way as opposed to being helpful. So being able to utilize that. Yeah.
And you're saying that is true for both the therapist and the client. What feelings might be there that are getting in the way to the for the process?
Perhaps, right. And so I think the therapist, the part of the craft of the therapist is being able to have the skill to utilize both what the therapist is feeling as a vehicle, as Douglas talks about in his book, as a vehicle to doing something in the room, or to work with the clients about their feelings as to how that's helpful or not helpful. So being really pissed off about this, how does that help you do what you want to do? Right.
Right.
Because if it's not helping, then why have it? Right. So, it's just there. Okay. But but so then how do we move it aside? I'm not in the business of getting rid of feelings. I think there are some models that want that the goal is to change the feelings somehow. And I tend to think that feelings change as a byproduct of doing and thinking differently. But then those are my models. So, I'm not here to say that EFT and all those folks are doing things, are not doing things wrong. That they're just not my models. But I think there's still a craft. There's still very much basic skills that enact those models. And I guess that's kind of my thinking, is that there's the skills that everybody has to use. And then there's the models that, we tend to pick, less than a handful of the models that we're really good at. But those models are only useful as they conform to the common factors, right, that Sprinkle and Blow and others have talked about. So in a way, you could either engineer it up that way, from skills to model to common factors, or backwards from here's the common factors. And so which models, what of my models enacts the common factors, and therefore what skills do I need to use? So kind of goes both ways.
Okay. So I'm going back a little bit just for clarification. You referred to Douglas, which is Douglas Flemons. And are you talking about the book Of One Mind, or is it in a different book?
I am talking about Of One Mind. Yes.
Okay. I don't remember that part, but I do appreciate it, of course.
Yeah. See, we talked about using your own thoughts or your feelings as a vehicle to take you someplace different, right? So for instance, if I'm getting really annoyed with a client, from my personal feelings, the thing to do with that I've learned from Douglas and others is to wonder, they're making me really annoyed. So I wonder if there's anybody else in their world that gets annoyed. And so ask about that. So I'm using my experience as a way to ask a question about their world, as opposed to what a lot of mental health and social work teaching is about, that the relationship with the therapist is the most important thing. And I think that is important, but I don't think it's the most important thing. I tend to think of us as family therapists as we're the hired help. We're the janitors. We've just been hired to come in and do a job. I often say, if they hire you to wash the windows, don't be sanding the floor. Right? Mm-hmm. But sometimes if you wash the windows, enough light comes in that they go, we ought to sand those floors too. And so you might get hired to do that. But we're the hired help. The relationships that are important are the relationships between the members of the family and their system. Right. So
I have a lot going on in my head, so bear with me. One thing is, for you members that are not trained as family therapists, we're covering a systemic perspective. So hopefully you'll gain a bit of understanding about how the training might be different, but as well as practical things to use in therapy when you're working with families, or when you want to use more of that systemic perspective that maybe you didn't get enough detail in your training. I don't know, because I wasn't trained as a social worker or in the counseling field. So that reminds me, and I'm going to say it and then I'm going to move on, because I want to go somewhere else. But when I was in my master's program, a professor said, which I think is similar to what you're describing is in Of One Mind, that when you feel something as a therapist, it's present in the room. So either someone in the room is feeling it as well, or like you're saying, Douglas explains, it's a reality of their relational system. So it makes sense to then use that to ask a question or, make it therapeutic. But back to what you were saying about skill, model, common factors, right? You said theory is only useful as it, I forget the word, but enacts the common factors. Is that right?
That's the word I used, yes.
Okay, great. So
we could use lots of different words, but yeah, that's the one I used.
Right. So does it make sense then to say that skill is foundational, and then really it's the common factors, and then the theory fits in with common factors, or is the learning in that order? As you mentioned, you learn the skills, you pick a theory, or whatever, you learn the theory, but then you prioritize the common factors. Wouldn't
it be lovely if we were taught that way? But we're not taught that way. We're not at all taught that way. In fact, what's interesting is that we are taught neither the skills overtly necessarily, nor are we anything but maybe exposed to the common factors.
Right.
So really what we get exposed to in our master's programs is the models and a bunch of other stuff that the law requires that we have to study, like diagnosing and individual and group and theories of personality and all of that kind of stuff, psychopathology, all those kinds of things, right? So, but pretty much in terms of what we do in the room on a week-to-week basis is the models. And even then, there's a lot of people that don't particularly subscribe to do any sort of model. They just kind of go in and do their thing. They're being therapeutic without any sort of thinking about craft, plan for exactly what they want to do and why they want to do it. Or, you know, and these are then the therapists that get burned out really early because they're just kind of going on their natural inclinations rather than having a craft to draw upon when things aren't going well, or even having a model. You know, if you know the model and you know the steps to your model, then when you get stuck, you can ask yourself, so what does the model say is the next thing I should be doing, right? So then you don't get stuck, right? But if you don't know your model, then you don't know, you know, you don't have in your head what the next step ought to be, so you can begin to work in that direction. So yeah, but wouldn't it be lovely if we were taught the skills that really are used in any model, and then taught the model philosophies and not just the intervention techniques? Unfortunately, there's a lot of therapists, dare I say solution-focused therapists, who are all about technique, but not about the philosophy, not about the underlying assumptions that drive the techniques, right? And so if you're going to be any good at any model, you have to know that underlying philosophy, and therefore the systemic theories that underpin that, right? And then the research that shows about common factors is the common factors is what works. So we know from, you know, many outcome studies that the common factors are the things that make therapy work. And so if what you're doing is not in some way in service to one of those common factors, then you have to wonder why you're doing it. If it's not doing something effective, right?
Yeah, so I want you to say more about the philosophy, and then I want to move on to, let's talk about the skills, right? So step one. So when you say the techniques aren't really going to be any good unless you understand the philosophy that are foundational to those techniques, can you say more about why?
Okay, so let's make sure so there's the skills, the basic skills that really anybody can use. In fact, if more people use the skills, there would be less need for therapists.
You mean in their lives?
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. If people had better friends and family, we would be out of business, right? But misery is an expanding industry, so I'm not in any worry of not having a need to train more therapists and
Do you make up that phrase? Because that's, yeah, I'm writing that down.
Okay.
Misery is an expanding
industry. Yes. Yes. So I'm not sure if I made that up or if I stole that from Anne Gustafson, or she said something that I then turned into that. But yes, I say that with some frequency. I need one of those mugs that has all my sayings on it. But anyway, yeah. So those basic skills, right? Then enact. You use the skills to do the model, right? But the model is more than just techniques. It's more than asking an exception question or externalizing or asking for an enactment or creating a genogram, right? It's more than those techniques. It's the philosophy underneath those. And all of the model founders read philosophy, and you can go read the same philosophy that they read, Wittgenstein and Derrida and Foucault and Bertalanffy and all these kind of folks that were not therapists, were not intending in any way for their models to inform therapy. But these founders read those philosophers and then created their models based on those ideas. And of course, then the common factors is that, I guess the philosophy that drives that is this idea of we should do what works, right? Which is kind of what evidence-based therapy is about. You know, the science of what we do is all about, you know, do what works. And so the common factors is sort of the list of what we know works. so if and it's not very difficult. There's not a lot of research and writing about that. I think that I would invite your listeners to do that, is to look at how their model, their favorite model, whatever it is, actually enacts the common factors, so that they can have confidence that when I'm doing this technique of my model, I'm not doing it just because I feel like it, and not just because the model says so, but because I'm looking for this kind of an outcome.
And Annalyn, do you know the common factors off the top of your head? Do you know them all?
Like the list of them?
Yeah, no. It's okay. It's okay.
There's certainly there's the things that the client brings.
Right.
There's a list of those things. So the things that, there's the therapist factors, right? Okay. There's the combined that, and the combined ones are things like that it's collaborative with the client, that it entails the client doing something, right? These are very similar to the seven things that Steve DeShazer said made a good goal. Right, so they're similar in that regard, but then there are there's things that they involve thinking, feeling, and doing, right? That they somehow are salient to the client, that it makes sense to them, right? So if what you're doing doesn't make sense to the client, then the client's not going to get it, not going to do it, certainly, if you're asking them to do something. And then there's the systemic addition that Sprinkle and Blow added, around that the view that we take is not of the individual, but of the entire system, right? And the idea of soliciting multiple perspectives, and that all those multiple perspectives is important. And this micro skills that was originally proposed by Alan Ivy from the mental health place was certainly talked about the common factors of the client and the therapist, right? And kind of what I and Jim Hibble, my co-author, wanted to bring to this was that bottom set of common factors of how to take these same skills but use them in a systemic perspective. So I know of many clinicians, either directly or I'm told about them, that the idea of having more than one person in the room just scares the bejeebus out of them. They can't, the idea of managing multiple people. And of course, I'm the opposite now. If I have one person in the room, I'm bored silly. I gotta, I have to have more people in the room. And as I often tell my students, I need to hallucinate in the rest of so I hope the psychologists watching don't worry about me that I hallucinate in all the other members of the family, but I have to have those multiple perspectives in order to really make sense of what's going on. And so the ideas that I'm trying to put out there, these nano skills, which are even smaller than the micro skills, these little tiny behaviors that we do, and you're watching, those of you watching are watching us do it right now. I'm hand gesturing and I'm doing my face, and you can see Illy is nodding and doing all these sorts of nonverbal, back channeling. These are the things that we do, some of it very naturally, but if you don't do it, then you have to develop it. And so that's kind of my broad picture of how all of this fits together.
All right, so let's go into, just as a brief explanation, Annalyn is writing a book with Jim Hibble on these nano skills, and we'll talk more about that toward the end of the masterclass. So let's go into some of these nano skills, and then I'd like to move into the question part of this, but we have plenty of time. So, but for you guys that are watching, just for you to know that we're going to go into what are these skills that are foundational, and how are the systemic nano skills a little different than perhaps the other micro skills that you may have already learned. And then how do we take that into the craft of question crafting?
Right, exactly. So like I said, Alan Ivy has essentially built his career on this idea of the micro skills. And he has written probably a book every year since he first started back in the 70s, I think, or if not earlier. And if he's not writing a book, he's writing a chapter in somebody else's book about micro skills. And he names about 13 of them, right? Many of them I don't agree with. because I would not have people use some of the micro skills he talks about. And there have been marriage and family therapy writers who have talked about basic skills, but they tend to think of them in terms of like joining. Okay, so joining is a basic skill. That's true. But if I tell an intern, go in and join,
how?
Well, what am I supposed to do? What exactly does that look like? And so I wanted to break that down into these tiny little behaviors that I'm calling nano skills. So Ivy talked about micro skills, and I wanted to talk about them even smaller as nano skills of things that you can do. Now, these are not things that you would go into a therapy session and think, okay, now I'm going to do these 3 nano skills, because then you'll stop listening to the client. So these are skills, right? So
I love that you included that. Thank you.
So Malcolm Gladwell talked about mastery when he talked about Erickson's work at FSU in Tallahassee about how to develop mastery, right? And so to develop mastery, you have to do 10,000 hours of practice. This is Erickson's idea now. 10,000 hours of practice, not performance, with a coach, right? So as far as I'm concerned, when you're in session with a client, that's performance. That's not practice, right? We talk about you have a practice, right? But that is not practice. That's performance. That's when you set aside all of that and you're doing the thing. It's Jim and I often talk about it in analogy of, say, the athlete, right, who works out in the gym and does all kinds of very specific exercises and weight training and cardio training and all that kind of stuff. Do all this training, but that is not the meet. That is not the tennis match. That is not the basketball game, right? That's the performance. So same as a musician, right? The musician rehearses and practice. And in fact, that's 2 different things. There's practice where you're by yourself working in things. And then there's the rehearsal with the orchestra. And then there's the performance, right? And so those first 2 is the getting better at it in order to then present your performance. So what I'm suggesting is that as therapists, to get better at this, to get good at this, is to practice outside of the performance of the session. Now, therapy is one of those things that if you do it enough, you get better at it just because you do it a lot, right? It's sort of like, anything really. If you do it enough, you start to develop ways of doing it that are more efficient, that feel better to you. It's kind of experimentation, right? You get better at it. But this is at the penalty of the client as you experiment with them, right?
Right.
And there's going to be a certain amount of that because every client is different. Every client family is different. But, wouldn't it be lovely to come with some skills that you can then put on autopilot, right? So that you're doing your part of it really well so that you can really pay attention to what's going on with the client. People talk about being inspired and the artistry of therapy. And people have a lot of natural talent. There are people who have natural talent with language or natural talent in relating with people, right? But not all of us do. But all of us can be taught, and all of us that even have natural skill can get better at it, right? And so I think it's important then to take seriously your craft. To fall in love with your craft, to know that I'm doing these preacher curls, so I can get that stronger, so that when I go to play tennis, I don't have to think about that muscle failing me. I know that it's there, and I don't have to think about it, right? So it's like building your clinical muscle.
Okay, so let's take one of those. In order to build those clinical muscles, so that they're not interfering, right? We're not using the client as an experiment for our
own growth.
Right,
yes.
Exactly. You mentioned joining.
Yes.
Have you already broken down the nano skills for joining?
Oh God, yes.
Okay, can you give us Yeah, that's how I feel, because I just moving the micro skills to the nano level like deadens my brain. I'm just like only because I'm not a detail oriented person. Like it's hard for me to think that way, right? but I see the value, of course, which is why we're having this conversation. So can you share with us a few of those nano skills that add up to joining, like what joining looks like? How do we teach joining?
Sure. So as I said, you're already doing some of them. So there's a thing in microanalysis research that is called back channeling, and you just did it, the nonverbal nodding. So the nonverbals that encourage the person to keep talking, or the gesture that encourage someone to keep talking, that's called back channeling, and that's one of the nano skills. So there's nonverbal back channeling and there's verbal back channeling. Verbal back channeling are what linguistics call introjects, and there's a gazillion of them. People often pick one that they beat to death. I was once supervising live, and I turned to the person sitting next to me and I said, every time she says okay, would you make a hash mark? And by the time we got to 50, I said, okay, you can stop. So she was doing back channeling by saying okay, but that's the only one she did, right? And so there's millions of them, and well, I don't know about millions, but there's a bunch of them. And and one of the ways to get a handle on how any one of us is doing these micro skills, nano skills, is to audio or videotape your work, or audio videotape an interview like we're doing right now. We could do an analysis of this right now, except that this is not a therapy session, because I'm doing all the talking. I'm yapping a lot here. But I'm certain that if you were engaging me as a client, you would not only be nodding like you did just now, but you would also be doing the verbal back channeling. Wow, really, yeah, gosh. All those little introjects. Sure. That sure, right? that has the function of letting the other person know that you're still here, that you're not mentally off, balancing your checkbook, right? That you are thinking about the next thing you're going to do, or which is classic for new therapists, is thinking up the question I want to ask. Right? Okay, client, just shut up long enough that I can get my question in, right? As opposed to being right with the client and back channeling, letting them know that they're with you, right? And so some people nod all the time until it becomes no longer a message, right?
Like stillness, right? It becomes the norm.
Yes, so it no longer has a message, right? It's the boy who cried wolf business, right? It doesn't have a message anymore. But if you nod with purpose, then you're communicating. Then you're saying, okay, yeah, that's important, right? By nodding to something, or by doing nonverbals. Yes.
So now I think I'm moving this from a nano skill to, no, I mean, it's still a nano skill, but I think I'm moving the application of it from the basics to the advanced, possibly. Because I don't know, you tell me, but I'm thinking, okay, well then, a student, let's say a student therapist, can pay attention to the way in which they back channel. That's one of the nano skills that is under, let's say, the micro skill of joining.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as you said that, I was thinking, wait, but we can do that intentionally with therapeutic purpose. So now not only are we engaging as people with natural sort of back channeling skill, now we're holding on to our back channeling to only affirm certain aspects of what the client has shared. So now so now what I'm thinking is the nano engagement on the part of the therapist is therapeutic. It's chosen.
It's purposeful.
How long does that take? That seems like, wow, that seems like that's advanced. Is that not advanced, or is that?
I think it is. Okay. I think it is because you have to have the skill of knowing what you're doing. What am I doing? Mm-hmm. Right? How am I using my body? How am I using my voice? How am I using my words? Right? So I got to get a handle on that, so that I have a way of using it purposefully. And then I have to have a structure that tells me when to use it purposefully. And that's what models are for.
Got it. But they don't tell you how to back channel purposefully.
They don't. Right. They don't. Wouldn't that be interesting if they did? Wouldn't that be interesting if every model took a micro skill, nanoscale perspective on, okay, and I occasionally see a glimpse of that. You know, DeShazer's last book, we actually had several authors to it, and one of those authors, that I think his More Than Miracles is the book, and he was saying that when clients say, I don't know, you know, you ask them a question, they say, I don't know. He said he interpreted that as, shut up, I'm thinking. So that's using silence, that's using going still as a purposeful act, because you're thinking, oh, shut up, they're thinking. So I will let them think and wait for them to respond. And using, I think DeShazer himself said that when he would ask the miracle question and they would kind of, I don't know, he would just look at them expectantly. Like, I can't wait to hear what you're going to say, but you do it all non-verbally. That's a nanoskill, and using it very purposefully in the context of a model. Does that make sense?
Yes. It makes sense that if you identify strongly with a model and you've used it enough, that you would naturally, I don't know about back channeling, because that's a tough one.
Pretty nano, huh?
Well, it's nano, but I also see it as, like you were saying, as something that comes naturally to some people and not naturally to others. So perhaps it's even easier to use it therapeutically for people for which it doesn't come naturally, right? I'm a super back channeler, so I'm projecting right now. So, but let's say, you know, if you identify with a model and you've used it long enough, like you were saying, and you're comfortable in it, then it's likely that you use the nano skills to bring out things that are relevant to the model anyhow.
Maybe,
but you should know that by watching your work.
Exactly. So if you watch your work, then you can identify, how am I using back channeling, if I am? How am I using validating, empathizing, summarizing? How am I using client language? How am I using weaving? How am I using soliciting multiple perspectives? Am I doing all those things, right? I think I am. You know, I'm sure, you know, people look down the list of nano skills that I have on, you know, this chart, and yeah, I do all those things. I'm like, well, but let's go see. Let me see your work. You know, I want to see a transcript of your work to see, is it really there? What I find when I listen to other people's work is the thing that goes out the window is validating, emphasizing, summarizing client language. That stuff goes right out the window. And people are all focused on asking questions and applying interventions. And if you're the great Carl Whitaker, or you're the great, you know, Virginia Satir, or you're the great Jay Haley, you know, people come to you because you're the great one. I've heard you're the great one. So people will let pass certain niceties like joining that. Okay, so I'll put up with Jay Haley being, you know, rather brusque because, you know, I understand that you're the great person and I'm here to get my help from you, the great person. You know, nobody knows Annalyn Schooley. I'm nobody. I got no, you know, name recognition. So if I'm a therapist, I have to do all of that to prove my credentials of, you know, that I'm going to join with you, and that I'm, you know, that the client doesn't come to me, or most of us, expecting that you're this great person, so I'll not worry about you joining with me. Every other one of us has to do all the joining. And if you don't, then your interventions are going to fall flat. The client's not going to do it. They're going to disagree with you. I love that Dougherty one that you did, where where if the client is doing yes, but, we're in big trouble. But if the therapist does yes, but, then the lights go out. You know, you know, so these nano skills enact certain philosophies. And that's another part of the book that I'm not going to talk about here, but knowing what your philosophy is, knowing your position of, are you an expert, or are you a collaborator, or are you a one-downer, right? Knowing, what is your position in this work, right? And then what are the nano skills that you use that expresses that makes that clear.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So Annalyn just referred to a video by Bill Doherty, the marriage and family therapist and therapy professor, author, et cetera, et cetera. I'll include a link to the video in the masterclass notes, where he talks about therapy as a linguistic craft, and he uses the example of when the client says yes, but, and how that's a sign to the therapist, or let's say a back channel on the part of the client. The client might say,
yes,
like,
but
right, it means the same thing. And then,
yes.
Yeah, or he's saying, and then he says, but if then the therapist says yes, but, so then the therapist now is in a position where they're pushing, right?
Or arguing,
arguing.
Never argue with the client. Never argue with the client. Yeah, right. Never say no to a client. Well, I mean, no, I'm not going to, lend you $100, but you can find another way of doing that other than saying no, like going to a question. Wow. So, or going to joining. Wow. $100. Tell me how $100 would make a difference to your life. Right. So, still not saying no.
Because they're closed-ended.
Well, and sometimes you need closed questions. You've got closed, linear, relational, circular. So you've got those different kinds of questions, but you can't ask those questions legitimately until you've joined. And those questions are built on that which you've established with the joining skills, validating, empathizing, summarizing, right? So, validating is making sense of, agreeing with their position. To validate is not the same as empathizing. Empathizing emphasizes more the emotional content, and I tend not to make empathic statements. I tend to do all my empathy non-verbally and in voice inflection. So I don't go, wow, that must have been really tough for you, because that sounds so trivial to me, And of course, in my when I train people, I eliminate the word feel. They are not permitted to even say the word feel. How did that make you feel? If you aren't joined enough to know how that made them feel, then you aren't paying attention. Right? So no one should ever have to ask, how did that make you feel? Now, I do permit, so what was that like for you? So what came up for you, right? But then the client has the opportunity to say a feeling or a thinking or a doing, right? Because each client will be in one of those channels, and we shouldn't demand that they be in one of those channels, right? At least initially. Right?
We shouldn't be forcing them into emotion if they're more naturally in
thinking, or doing, right? And this is, being able to assess for kind of the client's natural way of communicating is part of our job. That's part of our job, right? To ask the questions and to pay attention to what's going on, right? And it's through this validating, empathizing, summarizing, especially summarizing. I see inadequate amounts, in my opinion, of summarizing.
Okay.
Of therapists.
Sorry. I want to go back because I want to talk about all of them, and then will you go into summarizing after can you give us an example, let's say, of validating and then empathizing and then summarizing?
In some ways, I think summarizing is easier than validating it. So let me do it in that order, because it's easier, right?
Sure.
So summarizing is to echo back. There's echoing. So you're telling me I was really, really furious. Yeah. So I'm echoing, right? It's almost like a back channeling, but now I'm echoing client language, right? And then, so I was really furious about this and that and the other thing. I'm like, okay, so let me get this straight. So this happened, and then this happened, and then you were really furious about it, and then this happened, right? Did I get that right? And then you're nodding, saying, yes, I got that right. Okay, so then from that, I might say, okay, so what happened next? Or I might ask some other kind of question. I call that packaging, right? So to summarize is to say back with accuracy what the client just told you. one of the training things I do is the old game of picnic. Do you know the game of picnic where you're sitting in a big circle, right? And you say, I'm going to pick and I'm bringing potato salad. And then you say, I'm going to pick and I'm bringing potato salad and Coke. And the next one has to, so you have to remember everything that everybody said in order, right? And in exact words, okay? So in a way, summarizing is you can't let the game go any further than you can summarize back accurately. So if you let a client run on for 10 minutes, you're going to be hard pressed to summarize all of that or to even summarize the important bits, right? You're just going to remember what you haphazardly remembered. I can remember when I was a new therapist, the only thing I could remember was the last 10 minutes of whatever had gone on for the hour. And so I built my interventions on that 10 minutes, which meant they weren't very effective because I hadn't taken into account everything that they had said. So if you summarize frequently and you only you summarize in to make sure you caught what they said and you don't let them go beyond what you can summarize, then there's a couple of things that happen. You're getting the client language, and it is always better, in my opinion, this is a nanoscale, is to use client language, to capture it, to get the words they use, and then use it back. Use it back in their validating, empathizing, and summarizing, use it back in their questions, right? So it's not hard, in my opinion, to do validating, empathizing, summarizing, generating questions if you're listening to the client's language. Because if you've got that, then that's the building block of all of those skills, right? So in some ways, hearing client language maybe is one of the first skills that you're doing. It's a listening skill. When I teach residency for my university, it's a live week-long thing. After the first couple of days, what the students often tell me is they had no idea that they had to listen differently as a therapist than they did as a parent or as a friend.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. You have to listen more carefully. You have to listen to the actual words. It's not okay, in my opinion, to paraphrase something willy-nilly, because a paraphrase will automatically add new meaning to it. So stick with the client language. If they said they were feeling blue, you should not summarize back that they were depressed.
Right.
Because that's not what they said. They said they were blue. All right, so tell me more about blue. Who else notices you're blue? So are we talking navy blue, or are we talking this kind of light sky blue? What kind of blue are we talking about here, right? Yeah. You can actually do more metaphorically if you actually use the client language, and I'm now getting into an advanced skill. Sorry.
That's okay. It's hard for me too.
Yeah, right. So, so you have to, so in order to get to that advanced skill of playing with it metaphorically, you have to be able to capture the actual language. You have to train yourself to do that.
So this is also like something that came up for me as you talked about summarizing, but then again, I want to go back and give an example of validating it, empathizing. And when I look to the side, everyone, I'm just looking at my notes because here and there I write stuff down. So you mentioned you summarize, use the client language, and then at the end invite the client to let you know, hey, did I get it right? Right? Which is great because you're summarizing and also adding, correct me if I'm wrong. And
yeah, in research, we would call that member checking, right?
Member checking.
That we're checking in, did we get this correct?
Right.
And they might give it to us non-verbally by nodding. Mm-hmm. They might actually say things like exactly, and then carry on with their story.
So you might already know.
Right. Well, they may give it to you very quickly, right? You may not have to ask. Sure. If you get it correct. So you might know because they've told you in other ways other than answering your question.
Right. And then, but in addition to that, you mentioned, okay, the importance of listening and listening differently as a therapist. So that is foundational to being able to summarize. But as you talk about not letting the client get too far ahead, so in Picnic, don't let so many things be added that you can't then summarize. Then that brings up for me the need for interruption.
Yes.
Skillful, kind interruption.
Which is one of the reasons one back channels. Because if you're back channeling, that means that you're getting the rhythm of the exchange, particularly verbal back channeling. So that if we get this rhythm back and forth, I'm going, yeah, wow. Then I can occasionally go, okay, wait, so let me see if I got this right. Right. I get my turn. I get my turn, but I have to be taking my turn
all the time from the very beginning. I love this. Like this is so fun for me. The reason for that is that, okay, so self-disclosure, I'm a natural back channeler, right? But there are certain things in therapy that I don't struggle with, and interruption is one of them. And perhaps, and I enjoy talking to you because you take the time to research this and break it down. But I think that is part of it, that I don't do back channeling unintentionally, but it's always present. So the way that the client begins to understand the relationship and the relational rhythm of being in therapy with me is that there's that, I don't know, there's a pace, I guess, to it. So there
absolutely pace is one of the nano skills that I have on my list, is the idea of pacing, right? And so it's most of the time, at least initially, you as the therapist, I'm pacing the client. I'm getting their rhythm. I'm syncing up with their rhythm. That's that joining part. I join the rhythm that they're doing. So if they're drumming a certain beat, then I'm trying to match their beat with my back channeling and then getting my questions in, right? And so then my questions then become an interruption to that, right? But I have to be with them before they're going to accept that interruption.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, yes, and it is about helping them understand the rhythm of your therapy, but we have to start with the therapist understanding their rhythm of what they're doing.
Sure. So even that is a relational development, so to speak.
Absolutely. And it's done in these tiny skills. It's done in these skills of back channeling, nonverbals, and then validating, empathizing, summarizing before we even start getting to questions.
Right. We're not in questions yet. That's going to
not even there yet.
That's going to be Anna Lynn Masterclass Part 2. So, but in this, but I think it's important because interrupting is something that I think a lot of therapists have trouble with, whether they're, I just think it's one of those things that people feel, especially in the beginning, like it might be disrespectful, or how do I do it skillfully?
Or culturally. Sometimes it's culturally, or it's about a younger therapist interrupting an older person that's, against their culture, or, right. So you're right.
Agree. So you're with me and your experience. So
absolutely.
I think to know that interruption isn't, sometimes it's just, okay, hold on, wait 1 sec. Like if you have this rhythm, it's not that you interrupt with the perfect question, or that sometimes interrupting is as short as a back channel, to take a pause or to ask the client to pause once you're there in the relationship development.
Because there can be little summaries. You can do little summaries, right? So, okay, so he was the one that said that. Okay. Right. So that you can these little clarifyings, right? You can do that. And then there's the bigger summaries where maybe you track a whole sequence, right? And then there's the mega summaries where you're emphasizing the big major points of what we just talked about, right? That's an advanced skill. So each of these tiny skills can be used in more advanced ways. So there's summary at the small level, and there's summary at various sizes for different purposes.
But the idea that summaries are interruptions, that interruptions don't have to mean something negative, I guess is what I'm saying, that any verbal thing is an interruption. So,
right. So then it's the delivery of validating, empathizing, summarizing. It's how you deliver it that is either experienced by the client as a disruption, not just an interruption, but a disruption, right? Or as an encouragement of because what you're really trying to say through all of this is, I get you, I'm with you, I understand, I try not to have people say I understand. I think that's a terrible way to validate. Mm-hmm. I think a much more validating way or empathizing way is to say, I can't even imagine how you're getting through that. That's way more validating than, oh, I totally understand that no, you really don't. You haven't lived their life. So I always say it's more validating to say, wow, that is beyond even something I can imagine. I can't even imagine how you're getting through all of this. How are you standing upright right now? So, and that's an example of a validation and empathizing kind of thing.
Okay. So what's the difference between the validating statement and the empathizing statement?
Right. So, so you're telling me a story, and what I say is I summarize, perhaps. Okay. So you've said this, this, and this, and so it makes complete sense. Anybody who was experiencing this would do this. Yeah, of course. Right. That's kind of a Milan thing, right? To empathize the stability, to validate the stability of course it makes sense that you did this. That's validating their position. That's saying you're essentially that you're right to do this, to feel this, to think this, whatever, right? That it makes sense to me, right?
Got it.
But then the empathy then goes more into the emotional realm. And so probably what I do, if I were to really analyze my work, it's that I validate with a very empathetic tone. So my empathy is in the voice. And that's a whole other thing. I've often thought it would be fun to do acting classes for therapists so that they could work on their tone. One of the exercises your listeners could do right now is to take one of their favorite back channeling words, like really, and then find a dozen different ways to say really, 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 right? All of those express something different. If you've ever watched that commercial where the guy says dude to everything, dude, right? Same kind of thing, right? It's all voice inflection. It's not the word anymore. It's the voice inflection. It's the difference between I love you and I love you. Very different communication, right? That's all in voice inflection. That's a nano skill.
So for you, when you say, okay, you empathize with inflection rather than with words, right?
To use the old use communication theory, my empathy is in the command, not in the report. The report is the words. Yes. The command is the meaning I'm added to it through voice inflection. Yes.
And is that something you developed, or is that natural for you?
Well, see, I used to be an actor. I used to do theater. And so this is skills I developed in another area, which I bring into this work. But I'm recognizing how useful it is. I think that it almost takes acting skills to work with a family, because you have to be a different therapist to each member of the family. This is where using the micro skills and the nano skills becomes more complex, because it's easy to join with one person. But if you've got 5 people, then you're keeping track of 5 different sets of client language, 5 different sets of positions about the problem, about what's going on, 5 different ways to join. I have to join with mom, who's saying the kid is incorrigible, and kid who's saying mom is on my back and doesn't understand that I'm all grown up, and dad who says it's mom's problem, right? So I have to join with each of those positions, validate them, right? But I have to be different with each one of them. That takes being different with each one. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. I guess I'd like to find a way to talk about it that it isn't that they don't that we as therapists don't have to go get acting classes. So is the answer in the nano skills? Meaning,
I think so.
I think practical use rather than in having to worry about
absolutely
the right person for each person in the family.
So to go back to Erickson's idea of mastery, right? So where do we practice these things? So what are the exercises? Where's the equivalent of the preacher curls, in therapy world, right? So it comes in interacting with your family and your children. It comes in interacting with every human being on the planet. A story was told to me in my undergrad or my master's program that the MRI people out in Palo Alto used to give an exercise that the trainees had to call information. This is in the old day when you actually got an operator for information, right? So to call the operator for a number in a distant city, and then keep the operator on the line, asking them questions and joining with them for as long as you could, right? So I took that idea of the exercise and I joined with everybody. I joined with the server at the restaurant. I joined with the cashier at the grocery store.
Yeah.
I joined with everybody. That I'm practicing those joining skills all of the time, so that when it's time to do it with a client, that's on autopilot. My body just knows how to do that. It's just part of what I do, right? Is to do this joining. I will set myself at the restaurant, if the server comes up and they're really, flat-faced and, whatever, I make it my goal by the end of the meal, I'm going to get them to smile at me. I'm going to get them to soften up a little bit. Because if I can do that with the server, then I know I can do it with a client. I know I can do it with the angry father.
No, I really like that because I think there are therapists that say, okay, well, I already have this something, right? So people just talk to me when I'm in line at the grocery store, or they, tell me their life story when I'm.
Yeah, well, so you don't want to tell your hairdresser that you're a therapist, because then you're going to be giving away therapy. But you can use it for joining.
Right.
How long have you been a hairdresser? And, I see that picture of your family. So you can do the joining part of it.
But this reminds me of the idea of natural versus skill, right? So if you are a natural, so to speak, in the world and people seem to, come to you, or you seem to easily end up in very long conversations because of how you interact in the world, then the challenge is what is that? Let's label what I'm doing and let me do it purposefully.
Because even the one that does it naturally will bump up against people that they don't naturally join with well.
Sure.
Or that there are people who are trigger clients for them, that they don't like that person. I don't like that parent that's being mean to that child. Or I don't like that disrespectful child because they set off things for me. Well, those are the ones you have to practice joining with. You have to do it on purpose, right? And if you don't have a set of skills to say, so how do I do this on purpose? If you just do it the way you always did, but it's not working, you got no backup plan. But the skills say, okay, I don't like that teenager, so let me start using their language. Let me start validating their position. Let me start summarizing back what they're saying. I have skills that eventually some kind of therapeutic magic happens, is that then you start liking them because you start understanding their position better.
Dissertation. Understanding.
Right. So that it's, we talk all the time in our diversity classes that you have to appreciate other people's culture, right? To be culturally competent, you have to appreciate their culture. Well, how do you do that? How do you go about, I'm going to appreciate, right? I'm just going to force it out. Like,
you do it through understanding.
That doesn't work. So in order to understand, I have to be curious. I have to ask questions. I have to have a set of skills that allows me to set aside the things that would get in the way, like, oh, they're so disrespectful, that, it's going around in your head. I have to figure out a skill to set that aside so that I'm focusing on something else, like their language, by summarizing, by validating, by empathizing their position. And through that set of skills, then that therapeutic magic that we call joining happens.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then you're doing it wrong. Then you have to do something else. Then you're not catching their language accurately. Then you're not summarizing accurately.
Or maybe you haven't been able to set aside something as well. Like when you
Yeah, that it's sneaking in, right? I often say to interns that if you're thinking pejoratively about a client, you need to lay down until that goes away. That's a stealing of Haley, by the way. I can't think that way about a client. I lay down until that goes away, because they will smell it on you like garlic from lunch if you don't figure out a way to get curious about that. And that's a whole other. That's another more advanced skill. Yeah, but Douglas Flemons talks about it in One Mind extensively. He has lots of great exercises for dealing with those kinds of things.
And I'm going to include that for you guys in the notes. Sorry, Dr.
Yeah, we're out of time. How can we be out of time?
We're out of time, but before we are out of time, I want to mention that as you talk about setting things aside, David Bohm, in his book On Dialogue, refers to that as suspension. So the idea that we can suspend our own perspectives and biases in order to connect as human beings with anyone. But in this case, of course, we're talking about our role in the therapeutic context. So, Annalyn, thank you so much for this. So this is definitely just going to be part one of the masterclass, where we talk, because we only talked about nano skills, and especially the foundational ones, which are validating, empathizing, summarizing.
Client language.
And
client language.
Client language. It's essential to summarizing. And then I'd like to have you back to then move into that next stage, which is crafting those questions and explaining questions.
Sure.
Does that sound great? Awesome.
That sounds great.
Tell the members a little bit about what you're working on.
So I'm working on a book that tries to explain everything that I'm talking about, and then chock block full of exercises so that you can do those 10,000 hours, and the book is sort of your coach. So to practice these skills out in the world in lots of different ways so that they are at your command when you are in the room doing the performance of therapy.
Thank you. So Annalyn is writing this book with Jim Hibble, and the current title is Micro Skills for Effective Therapy and Counseling, a Systemic Perspective. And when that's out and published, I will include a link for you guys so you can check it out. So thank you so much for your time today, Annalyn.
Thank you.